So if you need a VPN, go Nord. Use nordvpn.com/Kimber to get a huge discount off your NordVPN plan plus 4 additional months for free. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the show notes. Protect your computer like a cricketer protects its nether region with NordVPN today. On it.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 36 of the Footmarks podcast. I'm your host, Behram Qazi, who you can find at DefMango on Twitter. And with me, as always, is Jarrod Kimber, who you can find absolutely everywhere. And the topic of this particular podcast, or the title, in fact, is The Dog That Changed Cricket. Because this is not one of your conventional Footmarks podcasts in which we're going to talk about the sport per se, like in-match details or someone's career. This is on a kid's cartoon called Bluey, and they did this dedicated episode on cricket, which we will dissect and talk about in this episode. But before we even get into that particular cricket episode, Jarrod, I want to ask you whether or not you expected it to be the tearjerker of the episode that it was. Got us all emotional, right? I mean, Ed Cowan cried, and then who else? My fiance, who barely knows anything about cricket, she cried. I got teary-eyed and emotional. Estelle, got all worked up and emotional. What about you?
Yeah, no, exactly the same. I think it's as good as a fictional thing we've ever seen on cricket, and it gets to the heart of why a lot of us love the game. But it's also smart and it's funny, and I'm assuming you had never seen an episode of Bluey before.
Absolutely not. And just the idea of cute Australian animated dogs talking in an Australian accent is right up my alley.
So I remember when Bluey first started. So my boys were too old, but when my girl came through, and and it was kind of before she was old enough to pick her own shows, and I'd heard of it, whatever, and I put a couple of shows on. And I, as an Australian man, I thought it was cool that she had an Australian dad on the show. And then you start to watch some of the episodes and you're like, this is, and you've got to understand, TV aimed at 4-year-olds is worse than you think, right? I mean, Paw Patrol is, I hate that show with such a vengeance that if I would attack the creators of them if I met them in real life. And there's so many, like there's some of these dodgy English ones. There's the Masher and the Bear one out of Russia. Like all these different, it doesn't matter where the culture is from. Most of those shows are just absolutely horrendous. And then you watch Bluey.
Dora the Explorer was another one that I absolutely abhorred.
Yeah. And so you watch Bluey and you're like, well, this is quite good. And as an Australian or as a cricket fan, there's cricket in the background. There's an episode where he's trying to watch cricket on the TV. There's a running gag in Bluey that there's always a tennis ball in the background of every show. Like someone's just been out playing a game of cricket. There's cricket bats in the background of certain shots and all this sort of stuff. So it was always in this world of cricket, but it's already, I think it's such a smart show for 4-year-olds. And I suppose like the most popular children's shows, like Ice Age, the Ice Age movie, that's just a fantastically put together movie.
Yeah.
Right. One of my favorite Will Ferrell movies is Megamind, which for whatever reason bombed and no one, it's not that popular.
I love that movie. And that has a great soundtrack as well, Megamind.
Yeah. And so if you make it so that adults will also play along, I think that works. Whereas that's the problem with Paw Patrol. The kids absolutely love it. But 2 episodes into Paw Patrol and you won't want to burn your TV. Right. and Postman Pat and some of these other things, they're just horrendous. And Bluey has the ability to do that. Having said, and so it's not the only, there's some really interesting episodes too of, there's an episode about how their auntie can't have children. There's a fascinating, one of my favorite episode is the Chinese restaurant episode, which shows you when you have 2 young kids of kind of everything that can go wrong in your life in a short space of time. Just really fascinating stuff about adults, about children. There's another one about the young New Zealand kid who has like almost a breakdown one day in the park when he's playing with his friends. And yet it's a show that my daughter will sit and watch for hours on end. It really is a remarkable piece of work to begin with before you factor in the cricket side of things.
Yeah. I mean, I had never heard of it, never seen an episode prior to, you sending this cricket one to me. And I'm so glad that you did, because that's exactly the same feeling that I got. That I was like, I actually enjoyed this. Like, I want to watch more of Bluey. And then when my fiance messaged me that, oh, she cried and she loves it, and if this is what cricket is all about, that she's in. And she was like, we need to watch more of this. And I was like, sure, like that's our next date or whatever. But anyway, let's talk about this episode now. And as you mentioned, Bluey had in other previous episodes just had, like, they had cricket at the back. But this episode was on cricket. Cricket was not a subplot, it was the plot. And it had a lot of elements of Australian cricket in particular in it, like backyard cricket, when young Rusty, the main character of this episode, who is, I'm guessing, a friend of Bluey's.
And it's worth saying that's another thing they do. He's not like a major character, but sometimes like a random that new theme in American sitcoms that you might have an episode about someone who's a marginal person. Rusty is like a marginal character.
And that's amazing, because they show you this evolution of Rusty, but we'll get into that. What I want to talk about right now is, the Australian cricket elements in there. Backyard cricket, then there's the park cricket with the AstroTurf. I did not know that was an Australian thing till I saw that episode and I spoke to you about it. And also the bit of sledging that is dished out by Rusty's dad. Bluey's dad. That was Bluey's dad.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask, like, you being from Australia and everything, did that really hit close to home for you?
Honestly, I know it's silly because of all the things that is in this episode, but the AstroTurf just felt like a validation to me, because I think I've said this before. So many Australian Test players began their career playing on AstroTurf, and I loved playing on AstroTurf. And it is looked down upon so badly. Isn't there a story about, I want to say, Franklin Roosevelt and the Pakistan? Who was the American president in the 50s who came to Pakistan while they were hosting a Test match, and it was on matting, and he said, I thought cricket was supposed to be played on grass, and then afterwards Pakistan moved to grass wickets, proper pitches.
I did not know the story.
I might have got the president wrong, but I know there was. Eisenhower? I don't know. I'm pretty sure it was an American president. But that's how cricket is always looked down on matting wickets and everything else. And you used to get it. You read the old reports of like South African cricket, and the England writer is like, yes, but you have to remember these weren't real pitches. They were matting pitches. I'm like, yeah, but both teams played on them, right?
Yeah.
And I've played on matting pitches. They can be tough and they can be tricky. And I've played on Astro wickets, and they've got their own challenges that are different than other wickets. So watching that was like, they didn't just make it a turf wicket, because there's no way a bunch of dads and a bunch of 5 to 9 year olds, whatever the cast, the various dog ages of the Bluey characters are, you're going to be playing on a turf wicket, right? Yet more often than not, they would do that. So they got small little details like that correct. And those were the things that for me really resonated. Cricket in Australia is a kind of communal thing. You see it in 3 different places in the Bluey episode. You see it on the beach, right? Which of course, Australia's not the only country that has that. A lot of countries with, it's big in, West Indies and Sri Lanka are 2 big beach cricket cultures as well, right?
Definitely.
But Australia certainly has that element. You then have it in the backyard. I think it's actually Bluey's front yard. I only say this because I think it's supposed to be Donald Bradman's childhood home. I think that's the front strip. I could be wrong, because I did actually look at photos, but I couldn't quite. I wasn't 100% that I wanted to go with that. But again, you have the home cricket, or the backyard cricket as we call in Australia, and then you have that sort of communal park cricket where it probably wouldn't be on the main ground just because it's too big, but it would be in a park, in a center of a park, and then you would have 2 or 3 families playing around, and mums and dads playing and coming and going, but the kids waiting and everyone putting their hand up to bat. That is the sort of the 3 main parts of cricket that you have in Australia before you start to play organized sport.
Also, the whole 6 and out thing. We have that in Pakistan as well. If you hit it into a house, you get the runs at times if it's off, like if it's crossed the boundary line, but you're still out. And I love
a hell of a hit, that one as well, because he's hitting a tennis ball and he hit it out of a proper cricket crowd. So hell of a hit there as well.
After getting sleds, so that made it all the more special. But anyway, let's talk about Rusty, the main character, as we mentioned, of this particular episode. And we saw him evolve as a batter through multiple flashback sequences. And one of them is how he learned the square cut. And in an attempt to not piss off his mom by hitting the ball to her through the window where she's like, cleaning the utensils and whatnot. I didn't know this, but I learned through you that this was an ode to the late, great Don Bradman, who deployed a similar technique back in the day. And this is something that shapes the careers of batters the world over at an early age. And that's something that I can attest to as well. Like, for instance, very similar to the Viv Richards story, who couldn't or wouldn't hit to the offside because there was like a house or a school over there. Even in my street, we played lots of street cricket. And in my grandmother's home, my cousins who would play day in, day out over there in my grandmother's driveway and front yard, they had a very strong offside game because there was the boundary wall on the leg side and they'd hit everything towards the offside. And this is the story for so many cricketers across the globe, wherever you may be. This is a very, something that unites everyone in terms of development, because you always have that grumpy uncle who lives in one of those houses who's not going to give you back your ball.
No, exactly. I probably bat my best on really dodgy wickets. And it's because me and my friends, none of us had like a flat surface to play on. And everywhere we played, you had to get used to the ball occasionally rolling across the ground or popping up. And, there were all these different things. And, Steve Kinane, the Australian journalist, who's probably more famous for his fights with Scientology than he is for cricket writing. But, he was, when I was young, he was one of my sort of idols as a journalist. And I've, gone on to know him, but he wrote this book and he went back and talked to all the Australian cricketers. And I think in Australia, we thought it was more of an Australian thing, whereas now we're starting to understand that this actually happened everywhere. But, the whole idea of Matthew Hayden having a long, narrow backyard, right? So where's he going to hit? He's going to hit straight.
Yeah.
Right. And all those sorts of things really do play a huge part. And, the rusty thing is really interesting because it's combining that side of things, that sort of, backyard novelty, but then the way he overcomes it, right, is more the Don Bradman style of things.
Yeah. And that's really interesting because you put in, like, whoever's not seen Jarrod's Bluey video on the other YouTube channel, go see it. There's actually footage of the Don practicing just that with a stump and a golf ball. And it's just amazing how they've taken such rich Australian cricket heritage and incorporated it in a kids show, which I love.
I think if I've never worked on a cricket project as a consultant, right? But I've been asked to a couple of times. It's never quite worked. And, when Ted Lasso happened, I had a couple of producers and writers say, we should write Ted Lasso for cricket. And I always wanted to use the cricket as part of the narrative and plot device, right? Because I thought it was quite interesting. So, for instance, I wrote a cricket sitcom, and in the cricket sitcom, I had the characters. It's a bit of a weird cricket sitcom, but quite often the characters die in my episodes and then come back next week. But the cricketers would quite often die in their batting order, right? And they would, if they were fighting zombies, they would fight the zombies in the style of how they batted. Like just little things like that I think are quite interesting. And that is what I think this episode does so incredibly well. Just those little bits of cricket stuff that they put in. And so, you could have just stopped with the backyard. Everyone in Australian cricket knows about the backyard side of cricket.
Everyone outside of Australian cricket knows about the backyard stuff because of all of the player interviews.
Exactly. But what everyone doesn't know is that next level. And the next level is how the backyard's shape the way you play, right? And then the next level beyond that is how some people use their backyard to specifically train themselves the way that... Do you know what I mean? So they just kept getting the little things right. And if you look at the history of cricket in popular culture, you will find that generally that's not what happens.
Yeah.
I don't know what your favorite sort of cricket media thing is, but there's a movie called Wondrous Oblivion, which I think is one. I think it used to be the full version of it used to be on YouTube. I don't know if it still is, but it's about a young Jewish boy. He's not very good at cricket, and his next door neighbor comes over, and I think he's a Bayesian cricketer who never quite played for the West Indies, who ends up being friends with Garfield Sobers and Frank Worrell.
Wow.
And it's a friendship between an old black man and a young white Jewish boy. They bond over cricket. They're both obsessed over the sport and everything. But it's a beautiful story. And they use cricket in little ways to tell the story. But Bluey in 7 minutes probably crams more of that in without it ever feeling like the storytelling is lacking. And as you know, I'm a writer and I'm a cricket person, right? So on both sides. And so when you see the Bradman thing, Australians, I think, intrinsically might have put two and two together. Wait a minute. He's throwing a ball against the wall and he's trying to hit it, and there's a water tank here and there's a stump. I think subconsciously they probably worked it out, maybe more than consciously. Yeah. But for those outside of Australia who don't know, Don Bradman used to throw the ball against the sort of the rounded bottom of the water tank. It was a golf ball, and he would use a cricket stump and he would try and hit it. Putting all that in, it's a homage to Don Bradman, but it's also a homage to how many Australian cricketers and cricketers around the world, of course, have sort of taught themselves the game. That is someone who understands cricket, right? Yeah. That's not someone who's doing an episode because cricket is cool and they like cricket. That is someone who deeply understands the sport.
100%. And text me the name of that movie that you spoke of earlier, but I agree with you that Wondrous Oblivion. I'm pretty sure that's the name. It's got Delroy Lindy in it. Lindy? Who I never knew. He's like this actor who's been in all these movies, and I had no idea he was English. Because you know how there's so many actors in America that you just assume are American, and they're actually like Australian, New Zealand, or English. And this is one of them. Yeah. And he grew up in like Brixton or something, and he grew up with a cricket background. I'm still waiting for some of the other guys like Idris Elba to do a cricket episode. A cricket episode of Luther would be absolutely fantastic. But we haven't been good enough at times of doing that kind of stuff. But there's a difference there's an episode of Bluey that's about squash, right? So it's really fascinating the sports that they've picked so far. Rugby league, right, was one that they did. But in rugby league, the episode is really about what it's like to grow up in a family where one of your parents supports one sporting team and one supports the other. And that sounds so stupid, right? But in a place like Australia where sport's so important, that's a really interesting thing. I grew up in one of those households, right? Where my mum barracked for one team and my dad barracked for another team, right? And so the rugby league episode's about that. The squash episode, again, very fascinating, is about how big brothers and big sisters always beat little brothers and little sisters, right? It's all about the relationships between siblings. Yeah. Again, it's still about squash, right? And again, rugby league and squash, not particularly big sports in the American market, which is what Bluey is ultimately being successful in, right? Yeah. And then the other thing is there's hockey stuff. But again, these are kind of, as you said before, in the background, whereas this is like, on every level, the cricket is part of the narrative. Yeah, it's at the forefront. And like you mentioned, right, it's the little things that they got right. It's just so well thought out that you enjoy every second of those 7 minutes. And again, for those of you who haven't watched Jarrod's video or the episode, you actually shouldn't even be watching this podcast. First, go and watch the episode and then come back to this. But let's get back to this podcast at least. And we see Rusty master his game versus spin and then later versus pace. That too versus the hard ball in these sequence of flashbacks. And, that scene in particular where he's squaring up versus tear away quick and he's playing, with a proper cork ball for the first time. And you see that he's visibly scared. Rusty at this point is shitting bricks, right? I just evoked memories of the first time that happened to me because we've all been there, Jarrod. We've all, faced a fast bowler for the very first time when we're playing with a hard ball and we really do not want to be out there. It's just so relatable.
Yeah, and I think also, my guess is in some Asian cricket cultures, you face a hard ball when you're a little bit older because a lot of guys come up through tape ball cricket, right?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, and so you might not face a hard ball until you are... do you remember what age you were when you first played with a hard ball?
11 or 12.
Yeah, so I first faced a hard ball when I was 7. Right? And Rusty is probably a similar age to me that I was at that point. And I remember the first hard ball I faced. And I don't remember a lot of my really early cricket. Obviously, I was so young and I wasn't very good, right? Like, I was playing too early. But I remember that first ball because it hit me in the nuts and I wasn't wearing a box.
That's happened to me too. Not with a hard ball. Well, I'll tell you a fun story. Sorry, quick segue. I have gotten hit in the nuts by a fast bowler with a tape ball, but once I was fielding at point in a hard ball game, and the playing surface, or at least the outfield, wasn't even. So I go down on one knee. It hits a little stone, straight in the nuts, a cut shot, dead.
And so I'm watching Rusty and I was like, I've been there, right? Like I completely understand that to the point at which I remember saying to everyone, you guys didn't even tell me that I needed this extra bit of equipment. I didn't even know guys wore this. I was 7. It hadn't even occurred to me. And, I've watched my son. My son, I think my sons might have played a couple of balls from hard balls. Oh, no, I don't think they have. But I've seen them field to hard balls. You know, my middle boy, he's kind of a fearless kind of dude. But you see, I hit a couple of balls to him with the hard ball, and you could see the look going through his eyes of this is full on. And I thought they captured that absolutely beautiful. Obviously, there's a whole story about his father being away and, you know, and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, the sort of things that Rusty's father tells him is the sort of things that my dad told me, which is at a certain point, you have to decide who you are. If you want to be a cricketer, you don't have a choice. You have to get behind the ball and you have to play it. And, you know, we watch Rusty do that in real time. And again, just go back. This entire episode's 7 minutes long.
Yeah.
And yet we've learned about the history of Bradman. We've heard about the history of backyard cricket. We've had a snippet of all the different places that you play cricket. And
the
now
spin
you
bowling bit. Also the spin bowling
bit about Shane Warne and bowling outside leg stump and all this sort of stuff. And then you still get enough time to tell a beautiful, it's probably like a 1.5 minute story, right? Yeah. But a beautiful little 1.5 minute story about this kid trying to work out how to handle this. And really, I've seen kids who I thought had real talent at cricket just not make it because that getting in line just does it. It's just such a hard thing to do. And I thought it was beautifully handled again. A lot of people complain that I'm not a former cricketer and so that I don't really know the game. Well, you know what they can't claim? That I don't know desks. I've been using desks for years. I'm a collector of desks, old and new, and I'm sitting on a new one right now. I'm the Don Bradman of sitting at desks. So when I tell you that the E7 Pro next generation height adjustable desk from Flexispot is legit, this is like Michael Jordan talking to you about sneakers. This desk holds 160 kilograms. It is as stable as anything I've ever seen, and it has under desk cable management. But really, the main skill here is that this desk rises and falls at the push of a button, and it moves super quick. And it has so many settings that remember your favorite heights. It really does it all. And I could not recommend the E7 Pro from Flexispot anymore, even though I am currently sitting on one of Flexispot's BS12 Pro multifunctional, adjustable, upgraded fabric, ergonomic chairs. My butt and computer have never been happier than when using one of Flexispot's products. So get over to their page right now for big savings.
Yeah, it was amazingly handled because you know what they got right, or maybe they get this right every episode because this was the first time I watched it, the expressions on the dogs' faces. It was just so on point, like every single expression, and that's what made it all the more heartwarming. But that scene,
there is an episode, just on the expressions, there is an episode where the little sister, Bingo, makes a stick bird. So she finds a stick with a weird like bird-like head and she makes it in. And then these other kids come over and they don't know that that's what she's done and they just pick up the stick. And there's a bit where you see the dad and you could see the look of his face of, oh my God, she hasn't seen this, has she? And then you look around and the animation levels and as you said, the ability to capture emotion is really, really high. And of course, I'm comparing some of this to Paw Patrol where everything's shit, but it is just exceptionally high.
I mean, I 100% agree, even though I haven't watched a lot of like 4-year-old TV. But back in the day when my nieces and nephews, they were young, I watched like baby TV. And Dora the Explorer was basically, you know, I hated on it because I was like, why? What's the point of all of this? But anyway, we're again going off track. Let's come back to Rusty and his story. And, you know, there's a great bit of comedy in this. There's that scene towards the end where the dads are all worked up that, hey, we can't get this kid out. And one of them literally says like, all right, Pat, this one's for dignity. That was hilarious to me. And that also resonates with me because we all know that one kid who was exceptional and, you know, ahead of his or her years playing in the street or wherever. And everyone's like, you know, the grown-ups are all worked up that we need to get this kid out because we don't want to look bad over here. And I think that was really captured perfectly.
So there's a kid I grew up with. I was a bit older than his name was Grant Baldwin. And we all thought Grant would go on to play for Victoria and Australia. And sadly, it never happened. He ended up being the Australian physio. And I always wondered how that kind of happened. And I haven't seen him since we were very young. His brother was one of my tennis partners. And I remember Grant came to the tennis club one day. And he must have been 11, maybe 12. And we were all playing a little bit of cricket. So he went out there. And there was like 18-year-old guys, 22-year-old guys, 27-year-old guys, and they were getting off longer and longer runs, and Grant was just stroking them away, right? And me too. Like I was trying everything, spinning it both ways, probably tried to flip her at one stage, right? Like whatever I could. And you do get that. And that's also a very Australian thing, that sort of the amount of times that it might have been Aussie rules football, it might have been cricket, it might have been basketball. The amount of times when a young kid gets really good and the dad suddenly they just switch into that Australian mode of no, we got to work this kid out. Like he can't keep doing this. I thought, again, it was a beautiful moment. And then also, we get to see, and these are the other things where we talk about how they nail the cricket. Bandit says, I'm going to bowl swing. The other kid says, the other dad says, I'm going to bowl spin. And then the last guy goes, are you okay with a bit of pace? They're not all being lumped in. They're saying, we're going to bowl 3 different kinds. And imagine, there are throwaway lines in this that no American, and I say American because I think that's the main audience that Bluey is now aimed at. But there's no American is going to know what the hell is going on for majority of this episode. They don't stop to explain it. They just go, this is what we say. And I think that's a really, really, again, they're just like, no, the story is strong enough. We don't have to explain every little thing of cricket, right? And I think that's great. And from my experience, that is certainly what Australian dads do. I've seen my uncle was a tactician cricketer. He was a real hard-ass cricketer. And I've seen him do exactly the same thing in a backyard game on Christmas Day just because someone was in for an extra 5 minutes than they should be.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have a kid in my street, or gully as we call it. It's gully cricket over here.
Yeah.
His name was Wajahat, as old as I was. And we used to have house helpers and security guards from all over. Sometimes my elder brother would join people who were older than us considerably. And this guy would just slam every single ball for 6. And it was amazing. And I always thought that, if he was to pursue this, there was something there, but he probably didn't ultimately. But yeah, there's always that one story that everyone has. And also you talked about how they were not explaining everything. They also brought in the field positions, right? Gully and point, even though they didn't look like gully and point. But Americans are probably going to Google that what is gully and point? What are fielding positions in cricket? And
there was a tweet the day after it came out with an American dad who'd watched Bluey, and he just put the fielding map up on Twitter and goes, what the hell is this? So this man has watched this episode and then be like, I have to, and so you're right. It's, from that perspective, again, it's completely immersive within the sport, this particular story.
Yeah, definitely. And now let's come to my favorite part of this story. The whole bit when, where Rusty's dad, who is away, he's an army man and, he's on duty or whatever. He writes to his kid and he kind of motivates him to play pace, even though the advice is kind of weird. A front foot pull, which is not something that I would definitely advise. But at least
I cut that out, by the way, because I had a big thing on that. But if you listen to him, what he says is step in front. And that could be with the back foot as well, when you think about it. And I didn't want to be too pedantic, but Rusty does play a front foot pull shot. Yeah. And settle down, Rusty. You just learnt to play with a real ball.
Yeah, but Rusty basically lives up to the advice. And he also lives up to this request because his father says, and take care of your sister for me. And the whole sequence, like the episode starts with Rusty's younger sister, Dusty. She's saying, can you hit me a catch? And it's cute because she says, can you hit me a catch? There's just a little bit of like a childish element in that. And he says, not now, Dusty, I'm nearing 50, which is the most, serious cricketer thing to do ever. And at this time, when Pat is all worked up and he's like, this is for dignity and whatever, Rusty goes back to those advices. First, he plays the pull and then he kind of, but he definitely purposely holds out to his sister, who is the only fielder in the park at that point. And she catches the ball. She's like chuffed. And she's like, oh, I got you out. And he kind of works with he plays along saying, oh, you did. I can't believe it. And that's the part that at least touched me. And I'm sure many, many other people, because they say that that's what cricket is all about. And that is what cricket is all about, because it's all about like camaraderie and, being there for each other in a way, because a game of cricket is it can be, it's an analogy to life. At least Test cricket, at least, is an analogy to life in so many ways that it ebbs and flows and the, different phases. And, the narrative keeps building day after day. I mean, the whole sister element, that was the part where I was like, okay, a tear might just fall over here because this has just gotten far too cute for my liking.
It's really interesting because that episode came out in the UK and Australia, I bet, a year ago. It's only just gone to the rest of the world through the Disney channels. or Hotstar, or whatever it's called in your local area. And what I found really interesting about that is it comes out just a couple of weeks before the Bairstow incident, and a lot of Australians were like I thought that was a bit of a Spirit of Cricket thing when I first saw it. But watching back, it's kind of more than that, because there's kind of two narrative. Well, there's one major narrative going through it, but there's kind of two storytelling devices going on. So one, you kind of have the game happening in front of you, but the narrative is actually from the future, which I only got probably the second time. First time I watched it, I was like, I don't understand this narrative at all.
I didn't understand it until I read your piece.
Yeah, I'm like, who's the dad talking to here? Because I thought he was talking to Bluey, the girl, and then I was like, well, he's not talking to Bluey because he's actually talking to Bluey, and she was there, so she would remember this. Yeah. And maybe he's talking to her in the future and she's forgotten it. I don't know. I don't know. But the point being that at the start, Bluey says, I want to play Tiggy, which is Chase, just another nickname for it in Australia. And he says, we're going to play cricket. And she goes, oh, it's boring. It's just someone hitting a ball around. And he goes, cricket's a lot more than that.
Yep.
So you have this whole narrative going through. But I originally, as I said, saw it as it's a lot more about that. And I thought it was a Spirit of Cricket thing. But having a look back at it, and I've now watched this, I mean, my kids are just obsessed with it. Not the 4-year-old, the 9-year-old and the 11-year-old, just as obsessed with it. My wife's obsessed with it as well. But having a look back at it, I do think it's probably more to do what they're really saying is that that cricket is all these different things. It is playing on a beach. It is playing in the backyard. It is hitting your sister a catch. It is learning to put your body behind the ball. It's growing. It's all these sorts of different things. And so, going back on it, I really did get it. And so you get the main thing is at the end, Bluey's dad Bandit says, that's what cricket's all about. Yeah. But I think it's talking about that one micro moment. But the more I think about it, he's really talking about the entire episode, that cricket is not just a sport in that one way. It is not just about hitting a ball around some grass. It is about everything that we've come up with. And, I've told the story before, I think, of my wife. So my wife is obviously of Sri Lankan descent. And she was born in the UK, but her father was born in Colombo. They brought cricket with them, I suppose, as a cultural, icon and loved it. But my wife was always frozen out of my father-in-law's cricket stuff. He would take the local boys to games and not her, because she was a girl, right? But when Sachin Tendulkar came in to England, and he was like one of the major stories in England, my wife would watch him when she came home from school, and she would tell her father about Sachin Tendulkar. And so they bonded over that. And if you look at through this episode, there's a touch of that through the entire narrative, the father and son of Rusty and his father, but then also the father and daughter, and how he's explaining that cricket is a lot more than she fully understood. And I think we all have. It doesn't have to be a father. It doesn't have to be a mother or an auntie or anything like that. It could be a neighbor. It could be a school teacher. But cricket is, at its heart, an artifact that we pass from each other. Like, if you think about it, it's been trapped in this empire Commonwealth box for so long because of this. You need to have come from a cricket background to understand cricket, right? And it is passed to us. So again, just a really small thing, but in those sorts of ways, that you've got a dad who's at war and some random, I don't even know what war he's serving in.
It's a hot area because Christmas is really hot over there.
I don't know why the dogs have war in their cartoon world, but anyway, but again, you have that, but they still have that bond between cricket and, I remember going through a bad point in my life and seeing my grandfather, and my grandfather was an incredible man, but he wasn't always, he was a teacher and he spoke in this sort of teachery way. But one day I was clearly going through something, and he just told me the story of Greg Chappell making 4 ducks in a row. I don't think it was 4 ducks in a row, but 4 ducks in a short period of time. I think it was 6 failed scores, if I remember correctly. And he was telling me the story, and he said, but when you ask Greg Chappell, he said, I'm not batting badly, I just keep getting out. So the point is, try not to be batting badly. Don't try to fail. Every cricket fan has a story like that and a connection with someone who is an older figure or whatever. And I think, again, this episode got to the heart of that.
Yeah. I think they stitched it up brilliantly because they started a narrative and then they kind of brought it to completion. And we see that with both Bluey telling her dad or asking her dad to go play Tiggy, and he's saying that cricket is more than, that. And in the end, that's proven. And then, of course, the whole subplot with Rusty and Dusty of how she eventually gets that catch, or he purposely holds out to her, and she's over the moon. And I've seen kids being over the moon with cricket like that. So the feeling that I got was like, cricket is more than that. Cricket is home. Cricket is a unifying factor. Cricket is something that enriches our lives and makes it better. It's something that we look forward to. And in the final scene, of course, where Rusty is giving a fist bump to his future self who's walking out to bat in a test match, that also encapsulates the whole backyard to baggy green journey, which I believe was also advertised in Australia. And that's also quite beautiful. And I didn't get that initially.
Yeah, so, I think that's one of the great things about Australian cricket. I remember Gideon Haigh being upset when they used that because he felt that was an intrinsic part of Australian cricket and they were commodifying it a little bit. And also, I think Gideon Haig's always been of the belief that cricket should be for amateurs as much as professionals, as in the people who play it in a park mean as much as the people who play it internationally, right? And it should all come together. Backyard to baggy green's always been a little bit of you play in the backyard, hoping that you make it to the baggy green, which obviously most of us can never do, and for a long time, not particularly easy for women. But the other side of that is that that is what the kids dream of, right? That's what we're doing in the backyard. And, in some ways it's a very Australian story, but as you said, gully cricket and beach cricket and all those different community cricket all around the world, it's kind of the same thing. We're all imagining what it would be like to play at the top level. But the other side that I really like about that is that we've all got, if you've ever played against someone who's gone on to be really great in something. So I played Aussie Rules football against a guy called Lance Whitnell, who went on to be an all-Australian Aussie Rules footballer. And I still tell that story of what it was like going up against someone who was just on a completely different level. Yeah. And that's essentially what Bandit does in that episode. Whoever he's telling the story to.
He's just so proud of the fact that he got to play Rusty or got to bowl
exactly. Him. And so the backyard to baggy green for me then becomes that he gets to share in some of Rusty's journey, even though he's not as talented as Rusty, he didn't put the time in as Rusty or anything else. But the backyard bit, he played a part in, right? In this case, it's on an oval, but you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, he played a part in that as well. And so I've always thought that the backyard to baggy green at its best, right, really means that Australia creates a society that makes cricketers. Rather than individuals who get good at cricket because they happen to be born in Australia. And that's the bit that, I thought was a really, really, a beautiful way of telling that story.
It was. And there's similar stories in different, settings and contexts. Like, I don't know if anyone's read Shoaib Akhtar's book. I mean, you should probably read it if you want to be entertained. But there was this... horse cart driver or some sort of driver that lent him a ride when he had no money. And Shoaib remembered him. And, later on, he paid him a visit. And it's just beautiful like that. It's a similar sort of story to, Bandit and Rusty. But anyway, before we wrap this up, Jarrod, I want to talk about what might be the most important point of all. The impact, the overall impact that this episode has had. Now, you've mentioned this before, that Bluey caters to all audiences. Sure, it's, aimed at toddlers, but a lot of grown-ups watch it. A lot of Americans watch it. It originated from Queensland, and you've mentioned how, it might be the best thing since Matthew Hayden, the cricket-related, that Queensland has
Not even cricket-related, mate.
But anyway, the fact that it has such a wide reach and it, goes out to such a broad sort of audience across the globe, it's unlike anything with respect to cricket media that we've seen come out of the ICC or in other media, because we've seen cricket movies, but they're aimed at this niche audience that already understands cricket. Whereas
Yep.
this Bluey episode, it's aimed at anyone and everyone, even people who don't understand cricket at all, and they'll just learn something new and maybe Google a few things. So how huge was this 7-minute viewing with respect to taking the sport to those wider audiences and in effect growing the game overall?
I think it's the best ad that cricket's ever had for itself. And because Bluey has a big audience outside of the Commonwealth nations already, I know it is a cross English Australian production, but I think I put in the piece that Bluey was viewed 1.4 billion minutes last year in America alone. And Bluey's new. They've only done 3 series. If it keeps growing the way it is, over the next couple of years, it could get even bigger. The fact that it is going to be watched by people who don't know anything about cricket, and they're going to learn more about cricket than you could learn probably even from the Bodyline series or Lagan. And I think those are something, and Wondrous Oblivion. We've made good things about cricket, but things have been made for cricket audiences. This is going to be a kids show. So every kids episode is watched 15 times.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
I've watched it like 5 times, Jarrod.
Yeah, it might end up being the biggest children's show in the world. It's probably in the top 2 or 3 at the moment, but it might end up being the biggest children's show in the world. On top of that, it's a fantastic episode, right? Like it's not like Bluey. There's heaps of great episodes of Bluey, but this is even amongst Bluey a fantastic episode on the next level. So I think it's got so many things, but the chances are that over the next 5 to 10 years, this episode is just going to be watched over and over and over and over again, right? Yep. Subconsciously, cricket will be more in people's minds than anything else. Maybe it ends up with a few more Google searches, right? Maybe it ends up with, Americans or other cultures, as Bluey grows. I think Bluey's mainly big in Australia, England, and America at the moment, but Bluey is watched outside of those places as well. But if it keeps growing and gets bigger everywhere else, maybe Brazil, perhaps Russia, all these other places get to see this. And, Bluey has the ability to latch onto things. So there was this huge trend for a few years on TikTok where like Bluey phrases, like these teenage girls from all around the world were like repeating Bluey phrases themselves, right? So the Bluey audio with them pretending to have said it.
Right.
Bluey latches itself onto things. Is the point. So having an episode that is about cricket could be really important because I just don't think we have had a great cultural moment with cricket in wider culture. There's been like little bits like Bo Cruz having a cricket bat in the Hustle movie and what's his name? Casey, whatever his name is from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles when he gets the cricket bat out and hits Raphael for 6. And
there's
all these little tiny moments.
Adam Sandler's movie in which they visit South
Dale
Africa.
Steyn.
Dale Steyn has a ball, Adam.
Yeah. So there's heaps of little moments like that. None of those really speak about what cricket is. Millions of kids are going to watch this. Millions of adults will watch this. This is aimed at non-cricket audiences and it will be repeated a lot.
Yep.
We've never had so many things come together at one time. I don't think there's ever been a more important piece of fiction made about cricket that isn't aimed at cricket fans already. The How's That miniseries was great. And, we've seen movies and other things, the Shahid Afridi Bollywood film that was made in India. We've seen really, really important movies before. This is just something else and it's something different. And I think it can have a long-term impact. And what I said at the end of the video, I'll repeat here, which is how we present our game is as important as how we play it on the field. And I'll say this, cricket boards often act like they are embarrassed by cricket, right? By the minutiae of it, the nerdishness of it. We just saw for 7 minutes, people go with it the whole time and shame cricket boards, right? And show them exactly how you can tell a great story about the sport of cricket and embrace the nerdy bits, not push them to the side.
Yeah, if I could frame that monologue, I would, if I could. And, that's the best part of it, that it encapsulates what cricket is all about in such a beautiful way. It gives across or, sends across such an amazing message in such a well thought out, well constructed episode that, you just feel like watching it over and over again. I'm going to watch it right after we're done with this podcast. And I mean, again, if someone hasn't watched it, please watch the episode before you watch this podcast and Jarrod's other video because you're doing yourself a huge injustice.
There's no point telling them this at the end of the podcast, though.
Yeah, that's
because they would now have already watched.
But basically, you also mentioned how, this will latch on And right now, even though the title of the podcast is The Dog That Changed Cricket, it's not that yet. It's the dog that could change cricket. So I'm hoping that, in a decade or two, it is, in fact, the dog that changes cricket. And I guess that's the best possible note to end this podcast on. So for all of those who listened in and are still with us, if you enjoyed this, hit that like button, share this with your friends, and subscribe to both this channel and Jarrod's other channel. We'll be back with another episode of Footmarks next week. That's all for now. Goodbye.